In the winter of 1289, on the edge of a gray stone village in the English Midlands, a woman chose to be buried alive, and the snow fell silently to cover the choice she had made. Welcome, dear friend. Come, rest your weary mind, and let me tell you a story of profound faith, quiet courage, and the strange beauty that sometimes lives in the darkest corners of history. Her name was Cecilia Hartwell, and she was 32 years old when she asked the stone masons to wall her into the south side of St. Cuthbert's Church. No one who knew her as a girl would have recognized the woman who made this request. The Cecilia of her youth had been soft-voiced and uncertain, given to laughter that echoed through her father's merchant house, quick to blush when the blacksmith's son looked her way across the market square. But that Cecilia had drowned in the river Severn on a bright April afternoon in the year of our Lord 1277, or so everyone believed. And the woman who emerged from those waters was someone entirely different. She had been 20 when she fell in. The day had begun like any other spring day. Her mother had sent her to collect watercress for the evening meal, a task Cecilia performed faithfully each week. The river was running high and dangerous from the winter's melting snow, churning brown and violent over the rocks, but Cecilia knew these waters. She had walked to this same spot since childhood, knew where the deep currents pulled and where the shallows held safe. She wore an old linen kirtle, already stained and faded, so it mattered little if it grew wet. She remembered the smell of the earth after rain, the green brightness of new growth pushing through the dark soil along the banks. She remembered humming a psalm. She was always humming psalms in those days before. The mule stepped into the water first. It was not her mule. It belonged to a traveling merchant who had come through the village 3 days prior, and he had left it tied to a post near the bridge while he conducted his business. It was a stubborn creature, prone to wandering, and somehow it had made its way down to the river's edge. Cecilia had bent to gather it, thinking to lead it back to the village. The bank was slippery, and her foot had slipped. She remembered that clearly the moment her heel lost purchase on the muddy ground, and then she was in the water, and the cold was a shock beyond all comprehension, as if the earth had opened and swallowed her into its icy center. The current took her immediately. She tried to scream, but the water filled her mouth, filled her nose, filled her ears. She thrashed and clawed, trying to find the bottom, trying to push herself back to the surface. But the river was too strong, and the cold had already begun to paralyze her limbs. She saw the green water, saw the light above growing distant, saw a single trout dart past her face with an indifference that seemed somehow cruel. This is death, she thought with a strange clarity. This is how it ends. But it did not end. A fisherman downstream, hearing the commotion and her initial scream, waded into the shallows and caught her arm as she tumbled past him. He pulled her out, and she lay on the stones, coughing and retching, her body convulsing with cold and shock. She was alive, but something had been torn from her in those moments beneath the water. The woman who lay on those stones, gasping for breath, was not the girl who had gone to collect watercress. She recovered in her mother's bed, and the fever that followed lasted 3 weeks. During those long days, when her mind wandered between worlds, she spoke in voices that were not her own. The priest came, and later the physician, but neither could determine what ailed her beyond the physical weakness that might follow such a shock. Her mother sat beside her and prayed, holding rosary beads made from oak galls, worn smooth by generations of hands. Her father stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at his daughter as though she had become a stranger wearing a familiar face. Her younger brother Thomas brought her broth and sat quietly, asking no questions, simply keeping watch. When the fever finally broke, Cecilia was changed. Those who knew her said she had grown quiet, that some essential brightness had been extinguished. She no longer hummed the psalms. Instead, she recited them in a low, continuous murmur, repeating the same verses over and over. She fasted on days that were not fast days. She wore a hair shirt beneath her outer garments, and when her mother discovered it, she wept and tried to take it from her. But Cecilia retrieved it from the fire before it could burn and wore it again the following day. It was as though she had touched something in the depths of that river, some profound truth or terrible knowledge, and she was driven now by a need to atone for some unnamed sin, to reach toward a grace that seemed always just beyond her grasp. Years passed. Cecilia lived in her father's house, performed her duties, and spoke only when necessary. She was known in the village as the girl who had nearly drowned, the girl who had come back differently. When young men came to inquire about marriage, her father turned them away with vague references to her continued delicate health. Suitors understood that a wife prone to religious excess was an unattractive prospect. It meant she would spend their money on the church, that she would produce no sons, that she would be a burden rather than a blessing. After a time, no one came. Instead, Cecilia spent her days in prayer and contemplation. She attended Mass twice daily when she could, rising long before dawn to walk through darkness and ice to the church. She read scripture when books were made available to her, and she spoke with priests about her visions and the strange compulsions that drove her toward holiness. Some of them were kind to her, seeing in her suffering a genuine piety. Others were suspicious, wondering if her devotion masked something darker, some spiritual sickness that required examination rather than encouragement. It was Father Thomas, not her brother, but the young priest newly assigned to St. Cuthbert's church, who first heard her speak of the anchor hold. She was 30 when she came to him, older now, with threads of silver in her dark hair, her face already bearing the lines that came from years of fasting and asceticism. She told him that she no longer felt she belonged to the world, that the presence of other people caused her pain, that she could only find peace in solitude and prayer. She told him that she had been reading the lives of the saints, the holy men and women who had withdrawn from society to seek God in the desert, in caves, in cells sealed off from the world. She told him that she believed this was her calling, that she had heard God speaking to her in the space between waking and sleeping, telling her that she was meant to be an anchoress. Father Thomas had listened to her with grave attention, his young face serious beneath his tonsure. He was perhaps 35 himself, a scholar and a mystic, a man who understood that the church needed witnesses to the divine, even if those witnesses inhabited strange places and made unusual choices. He did not dismiss her immediately. Instead, he asked her questions, probing gently at the roots of her desire. Was it escape she sought, or genuine sanctity? Was she fleeing the world, or embracing God? Cecilia could not always distinguish between the two, but she spoke with such conviction, such hunger for something beyond the ordinary existence of a parish woman, that Father Thomas found himself believing her. He had brought the matter before the bishop, who was also skeptical but ultimately willing. The practice of anchoritism was no longer as common as it had been in earlier centuries. The great age of desert fathers and wilderness mystics had given way to a more ordered, institutional form of faith, but it was not forbidden. The bishop had interviewed Cecilia himself, and his Latin was precise and rapid, his questions designed to penetrate the disguises we wear when speaking to authority. But Cecilia had answered him with such clarity, such unwavering certainty about the rightness of her calling, that even his skepticism had been worn down. Perhaps he had finally said, this was indeed the path God had chosen for her. The church would provide the anchor hold, and she would live there in contemplation until the day of her death. She would be sealed in, with only small windows to receive food and to communicate with the outside world. She would be dead to the world, truly dead in Christ, rising again in the resurrection. Her father had raged. Her mother had wept. Thomas, her brother, had simply held her hand and told her he would bring her rosemary every time the herb was fresh, and he had kept that promise for 15 years, until a fever took him in the spring. But Cecilia's mind was already made up, and nothing they could say would sway her. She was 32 years old, and she had already lived 2 lives, the bright girl before the river, and the penitent woman after. This third life would be lived in stillness, in darkness, in a room no larger than a grave, and it felt to her like finally coming home. The anchor hold had been built into the south wall of the church, a small stone chamber perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a narrow window that looked out onto the churchyard and another that opened into the church itself, so that Cecilia could hear the Mass and receive the sacrament without exposing herself to the world. The walls were thick stone, 2 feet deep, with mortar packed carefully between each layer. The roof was low, barely allowing her to stand, and the floor was bare earth covered with straw that was changed by the verger each month. There was a narrow bench, a small shelf for her few books and her water pitcher, a chamber pot that was emptied from outside. There was a small shelf built into the wall that opened into the church, where food could be passed through, bread, thin pottage, sometimes an apple or a piece of cheese. It was meant to be a cell for contemplation, a womb from which a new spiritual self might be born. On a cold November morning, with frost glittering on the grass of the churchyard, and the sky the color of iron, Cecilia had walked out of her father's house for the last time, She had worn her finest gown, a deep blue wool with embroidered cuffs, and she had styled her hair carefully, as though for a wedding. In a way, it was a wedding. She was marrying herself to God, and this was her bridal day. The entire village had come to witness the ceremony, bundled in their winter cloaks, breath misting in the frozen air. There had been a mass, and the bishop himself had come from a neighboring town to perform the ritual of enclosure. He had blessed the anchor hold, blessed Cecilia, spoken words of consecration in Latin that had rolled across the churchyard like distant thunder. Then the masons had begun their work. She had walked into the cell while they waited outside, holding their mortar and their stones. She had sat on the bench and arranged her gown around her carefully. She had folded her hands in her lap. And then, as Father Thomas watched from the doorway with tears running down his face, the masons had begun to seal the opening. Stone by stone, they had covered the entrance, filling the gap where she had walked through. They had smoothed mortar over the crevices, creating an unbroken expanse of wall. Within an hour it was done. Cecilia had been entombed, living in the stone body of the church, and the world had been sealed away on the other side. The first winter was the hardest. She had not anticipated how thoroughly the cold would penetrate the stone, how the icy air would settle into the cell like a living thing, sapping the warmth from her body even as she moved, even as she wrapped herself in the one blanket that had been permitted to her. She had expected solitude, and she had found it, but she had not expected the sound of it. The way that silence itself seemed to have a voice, a pressure against her ears that was almost unbearable. She could hear the mice in the walls, skittering and scratching. She could hear the wind outside, mourning across the churchyard. She could hear the vibration of the church bells above her head, felt rather than heard, transmitted through the stone into her bones. And she could hear her own heartbeat, vast and thunderous in the darkness, the sound of her own breathing, the small sounds of her body moving against the straw. The other anchoresses whose stories she had read had written of visions, of ecstatic experiences, of the direct presence of God flooding their cells like light. Cecilia experienced instead a slow, steady erosion of the boundary between herself and the stone around her. Days and nights began to blur together, distinguished only by the times when food passed through the shelf window, or when she could hear the priest chanting the offices through the other window. She began to lose track of time, to forget what month it was or how many years she had been in the cell. Was it Tuesday or Thursday? Was it the feast of St. Catherine or the feast of St. Michael? The church bells told her when it was time for Mass, and that was all the temporal orientation she required. The hunger was constant. The portions that came through the window were meager, designed to keep her alive but not comfortable. A small bowl of thin pottage, bread that was often hard and stale, water in a wooden cup. Sometimes there was a piece of dried fish, or a few currants, or a slice of apple. She learned to make the food last, to eat slowly, to chew each bite thoroughly so that the meager portions would occupy her mouth and throat and belly for as long as possible. She learned what it meant to be truly hungry, the kind of hunger that transcended mere appetite and became a physical obsession. She found herself thinking about food constantly, remembering the taste of her mother's honey cakes, the texture of fresh bread with butter, and the sweetness of strawberries in summer. These memories were torture and comfort in equal measure. The cold was worse than hunger. By mid-January, the temperature in the cell had dropped to a point where she could see her breath, where the water in her pitcher had a thin crust of ice on top each morning. She had been given one blanket, a threadbare thing made of rough wool that provided almost no warmth. She had asked for more, and Father Thomas had asked the bishop, but the bishop had said that comfort was not the point of anchoritism, that mortification of the flesh was essential to the spiritual work she had come to do. Warmth was a luxury, and luxury was a sin. So she had learned to exist with cold as her constant companion, her unwavering presence. She wrapped herself in the blanket and huddled on her narrow bench, and when the cold became unbearable, she prayed. She prayed for warmth, and when no warmth came, she prayed for the strength to endure the cold. She prayed for her mother, whom she missed with an ache that sometimes felt as sharp as the bite of frost. She prayed for her brother Thomas, hoping that her sacrifice was somehow easing his path through this difficult world. She prayed for forgiveness, though she still did not fully understand what she needed to be forgiven for, and she prayed for the coming of spring, though the spring seemed always impossibly distant. By February, her fingers had begun to swell, the joints stiffening, the skin becoming raw and cracked. She had no warming fire, and the only source of heat was from her own body, which was itself being slowly consumed by cold and hunger. She found that if she moved her fingers constantly, flexing and extending them, keeping them active, the pain was somewhat lessened. She spent hours with her hands spread before her, watching them move as though they belonged to someone else, thin and pale in the dim gray light that filtered through the small window. It was during this time, in the depths of that first winter, that she had her first vision. She had been praying at the office of Matins, singing it quietly, her voice raw from disuse, when a peculiar warmth had begun to spread through her chest. At first, she thought it was merely her body's response to the exertion of singing, but the warmth had continued to grow, suffusing her limbs, easing the constant ache of cold that had become almost part of her consciousness. And then she had felt it unmistakably, as though a hand had been placed upon her head, a presence, vast and tender, that seemed to fill the small cell with light. There had been no vision, no appearance of Christ or the saints, but rather a feeling, overwhelming in its intensity, of being loved entirely and completely, accepted in all her brokenness and fear and frailty. It had lasted only a moment, but in that moment, Cecilia had understood, finally, why she had come to this cell. She was not here to escape. She was not here to punish herself, though the cold and hunger would certainly accomplish that. She was not even here out of some residual guilt or unprocessed trauma from the river. She was here because she had glimpsed something in those depths, in the moment when she thought she was dying, that was more real and more true than anything in the ordinary world. She was here because the boundary between self and world had become unbearably painful, and only in this cell, sealed away from all the demands and expectations of human society, could she begin to dissolve that boundary and merge with something larger than herself. The vision had lasted only a moment, but its effects had sustained her through the rest of that first terrible winter. When the cold threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered it. When hunger gnawed at her, she remembered it. When the silence began to feel like it might drive her mad, she remembered the presence of that love, vast and impersonal and utterly accepting. And very slowly, the cell had begun to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The years that followed blurred together into a rhythm that was both utterly monotonous and strangely rich with meaning. Spring came, that first spring of 1289, with birdsong filtering through her small window and the smell of earth awakening after winter. Cecilia had emerged from the depths of the cold as though from a chrysalis, transformed. She still fasted, still prayed constantly, still lived in near total deprivation, but something in her had shifted. The struggle had given way to acceptance. The resistance had surrendered. Father Thomas had been her primary contact with the outside world during those early years. He was the one who brought most of her food, passing it through the shelf window with careful, reverent hands. He was also the one to whom she confessed, though her confessions were unusual. She spoke not of sins, but of insights, of moments when the boundary between her soul and God seemed to thin to the point of transparency. He had listened with an intensity that suggested he understood something of what she was experiencing, though he himself lived in the world, surrounded by people and duties and the ordinary complications of a human life. In the early days, he had tried to provide her with comfort within the bounds of what was permitted. He had slipped her extra bread sometimes, hidden beneath the standard portion. He had arranged for her blanket to be replaced with one that was marginally warmer, claiming that the old one had deteriorated beyond use. He had spoken with the verger about changing her straw more frequently during the cold months, ensuring that at least her floor was not damp and moldy. But Cecilia had gently refused most of these kindnesses. She had asked him to stop bringing the extra bread. She had told him that the blanket was sufficient. She had said that if she began to accept comfort, she might lose her way, might begin to believe again in the reality of the flesh and its needs, might find herself pulled back toward the world she had deliberately rejected. Father Thomas had respected her wishes, though she could see the concern in his eyes, the way his jaw would tighten when he saw her in the dim light of the church, visible through her small window, her face grown thin and angular, her eyes enormous and luminous. She was becoming less substantial each year. It seemed to him as though the physical world was losing its hold on her. Sometimes he wondered if he was witnessing the slow approach of death, if his role was simply to bear witness to a woman voluntarily fading away, consumed by her own faith. But Cecilia was not fading away. If anything, she was becoming more present, more vivid, more real. It was simply that her presence was beginning to operate on a frequency that the ordinary world could not quite perceive. She had developed an internal richness of experience that more than compensated for the external poverty of her circumstances. Her days were filled with prayer, yes, but also with an intricate inner life. She would spend hours in meditation, exploring the landscapes of her own consciousness, witnessing the patterns that arose and dissolved in the silence. She would contemplate the mystery of her own existence, how she had come to be in this cell, what strange concatenation of events had led her to this precise moment. She would think about the river, the moment of drowning, and she began to understand it not as tragedy, but as transformation, the essential rupture that had broken her open to the possibility of a different kind of life. She had learned, too, through long observation, the rhythms of the church around her. She knew when the verger's footsteps would come, always in the morning, always with the same cadence. She knew the pattern of Father Thomas's visits, the way he would pause before passing her food through, as though gathering his courage. She knew the sound of the church bells with such intimacy that she could distinguish between the bell ringer's different moods, the way his touch on the rope would change the tone of the sound itself. She had learned the liturgical year so thoroughly that she could anticipate each feast day, each saint's commemoration, each shift in the prayers and readings. The church was not a building around her. It had become an extension of her own consciousness, and she was aware of it with the same intimate knowledge that one has of one's own body. The village, too, had its rhythms, though she experienced them only through sound and occasional glimpses through her narrow window. She could tell when it was market day by the increased traffic past the church, the voices of merchants hawking their wares. She knew when someone had died by the tolling of the bell, the particular pattern that indicated the age and gender of the deceased. She had heard births announced by rejoicing bells, weddings celebrated with the full peal of the tower bell. She had learned to read the seasons not only by temperature and the light through her window, but by the patterns of human activity. Summer was a busy season, full of voices and movement. Winter was quiet, withdrawn, a time when the village seemed to hold its breath. Her relationship with the bishop had never been warm. The bishop who had granted her permission to become an anchoress had died 7 years into her enclosure, and his replacement was a harder man, more concerned with practical matters than with the spiritual eccentricities of individual souls. He had come to inspect her cell once, early in his tenure, and had found her sitting in meditation, oblivious to his entrance. She had not immediately responded to his presence, and this had offended him. He had reported to Father Thomas that he questioned whether Cecilia was truly engaged in prayer or whether she had simply abandoned her senses, retreated into a kind of stupor. The distinction mattered, he said, because one was a valid spiritual practice, and the other was merely a waste of the church's resources. But Father Thomas had defended her, and the bishop had eventually relented. Cecilia's enclosure was allowed to continue, though the level of official support diminished somewhat. The food portions were not increased. No additional resources were allocated to her comfort. She was permitted to remain, but it was made clear that she was to be tolerated rather than celebrated. This suited Cecilia perfectly. She had never sought recognition or celebration. Indeed, the fewer people who paid attention to her, the easier it was to maintain her inner work. She had realized over time that her anchoritism was not really about the world at all. It was not meant to be a witness to the village, a visible sign of devotion or holiness. It was entirely for herself, for her own soul's journey. The cell was the necessary container for that work, but the real transformation was happening inside, in the privacy of her own consciousness, in the slow dissolution of the self that clung so desperately to existence. By the 10th year of her enclosure, Cecilia had become something of a legend in the village, though most people knew her only as an idea rather than a person. The Anchoress, the woman in the wall. Children whispered about her, imagining her as a ghost, a saint, a martyr. Older people remembered her as Cecilia Hartwell, the girl who had nearly drowned in the river. Some said she had gone mad from the trauma of it. Others said she had been blessed by God with a special vocation. The truth, as is so often the case, was far more complicated than either explanation allowed. She had never remarked upon it to Father Thomas, but she had become aware, around the 15th year of her enclosure, that the cold no longer bothered her as it once had. It was not that she had become immune to it. Her body still suffered, her fingers still swelled. The chilblains still appeared on her toes each winter, but something in her perception of the cold had shifted. She could feel it, but it no longer seemed like an enemy. It was simply a presence, a reality she inhabited, no different in essence from the stone walls around her or the breath in her lungs. This acceptance had made the winters more bearable, though not necessarily less harsh. She had also begun to experience a strange phenomenon that she found difficult to describe to Father Thomas when he asked about her well-being. Time seemed to have become plastic, malleable. Sometimes an entire day would pass in what felt like a few minutes, as though her consciousness had compressed duration itself. At other times, an hour of sitting in stillness would expand to fill what seemed like days. She no longer knew whether she was aging normally, or whether some peculiar process of temporal distortion was occurring within the cell. She did not have a mirror, so she could not see her face. When she held her hands in the dim light, they appeared to her as those of an old woman, lined and spotted, the skin transparent and thin. But she might have been 55 years old, or she might have been 70. She genuinely did not know, and this uncertainty did not disturb her as it once would have. What did disturb her, occasionally, was the memory of having been young. She would remember, with a vividness that seemed almost like happening rather than remembering, the feeling of the sun on her face when she was a girl, the taste of honey cakes, the weight of her mother's hand holding hers as they walked to market. She would remember the color of the river, the way it had looked on that spring day before it took her, the green brightness of the water and the sky above it. These memories were precious to her now, in a way that they had not been when she was living them, and they also caused her a peculiar kind of grief. The girl who had experienced those things was dead, as surely as if she had drowned in the river. The person who remembered them was something else entirely, something that did not fit neatly into any category of human existence. But it was precisely this strangeness, this displacement from ordinary life, that made her anchoritic practice feel authentic to her. She had not sought comfort or safety by fleeing to the cell. She had sought rupture, and rupture was what she had found. She had sought to step outside of time, and time had indeed become strange, unreliable, negotiable. She had sought to touch something beyond the ordinary world, and in the darkness and cold and silence of her cell, she had touched it again and again. The winter of 1304 was particularly severe. This was now 15 years into her enclosure, and though she had become accustomed to the cycle of cold, something about this particular winter felt different. The snow fell heavier than it had in previous years, and it did not melt away in spring as it usually did. November gave way to December, and December gave way to January, and the snow continued to accumulate outside her window. The temperature in the cell dropped to a point that was almost incomprehensible. Water froze not only in her pitcher, but in the very stones of the walls. Her breath came out in clouds so thick that she could barely see her hands before her face. She had begun to cough around November, a dry, persistent cough that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. She did not mention it to Father Thomas, knowing that he would worry, knowing that he might attempt to arrange for her to receive additional warmth or care. She did not want additional warmth or care. She wanted only to continue her practice, to maintain the integrity of her enclosure, to remain faithful to the commitment she had made. By January, her cough had worsened. She was bringing up blood when she coughed, small dark specks that stained her sleeve. Her appetite, already minimal, had disappeared almost entirely. The food that came through the window, thin pottage mostly, now that it was winter, sat untouched until it spoiled and had to be removed. She was sustained only by water, and even that seemed difficult to swallow. Father Thomas noticed immediately on his next visit. He had looked at her through the small window, and his face had gone pale. He had not spoken to her directly, but had gone immediately to inform the new bishop. There had been another change in bishops, and this one was younger, more inclined toward a stern orthodoxy, that the anchoress was dying. The bishop had been, to his credit, more concerned than Cecilia might have expected. He had come to visit her himself, a younger man with a severe face and penetrating eyes. He had looked at her in the cell and had asked, in a voice that was not unkind, whether she wished to receive the last rites. Cecilia had shaken her head. She was not dying yet, she had said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. She was simply passing through a difficult period. The winter would end, as winters always did, and she would recover. But even as she said the words, she knew that they were not true. Something fundamental had shifted in her body. She could feel it, the way one can feel the approach of great weather, a kind of loosening, a preparation for departure. The cough that racked her lungs was not temporary. The blood she was bringing up was not a passing symptom. Her body was beginning to fail, and she was aware that this failure was not accidental. This was the end of her enclosure, approaching with the certainty of winter itself. She did not fear it. This surprised her, but it was true. In those long nights when she lay on her bench, wrapped in her thin blanket, coughing until her ribs ached, she found that she was not afraid. She had spent 26 years preparing for this, though she had not known it. The dissolution of the self that she had worked toward through fasting and prayer and deprivation was finally completing itself. Her body was returning to the earth. Her consciousness, which had already begun to stretch beyond the boundaries of the self, was preparing to dissolve into something larger. The worst part, strangely, was not the physical suffering, but the sudden intensity of memory that accompanied it. As her body weakened, her past seemed to become more vivid, as though it were being projected onto the stone wall of her cell. She saw her mother's face with perfect clarity, every line, every expression. She remembered conversations word for word. She recalled the taste of specific meals, the feel of specific fabrics against her skin, the exact quality of light on specific afternoons. It was as though her dying consciousness was desperately trying to hold onto the world, to preserve it against the approaching obliteration. She found herself weeping, though she had not wept in decades. The tears came silently, running down her thin cheeks, and she did not try to stop them. She was grieving not for herself, but for the girl she had been, for the life she had not lived, for the ordinary joys, marriage, children, the comfort of home and family, that she had deliberately rejected. She was grieving for her mother, who had died 5 years into her enclosure without ever truly coming to terms with the choice her daughter had made. She was grieving for Thomas, her beloved brother, whose fever had taken him only 3 years after that. She was grieving for all the human connections, all the ordinary warm things that were incompatible with the path she had chosen. And yet, underneath the grief, there was something else, not comfort exactly, but a kind of clarity. She had made her choice with full awareness of what she was giving up. She had walked into this cell with open eyes. She had not been forced. And in the years since, she had discovered things that those on the outside could never know, experiences of consciousness and presence that transcended the ordinary joys she was grieving. She could not say which was better, the life she had rejected or the one she had chosen. They were simply different realities, and she had been given the grace to touch one of them deeply, completely, wholly. As February passed into March, she began to spend more time in sleep than in waking. Father Thomas came every day now, and he brought with him the young priest who assisted him, Father Matthew, who was kind and gentle and grieved openly at her failing condition. They had tried to convince her to accept some form of additional care, a warming fire outside her cell, more substantial food, but she had refused. She had said that she was where she needed to be, that the conditions of her enclosure were exactly as they should be, that she had no desire to alter them. She had asked only one thing, that when she died, they would not remove her from the cell. She had asked to be buried there, in the place where she had lived. Her body returned to the stone and earth from which it had been formed, dissolved into the very walls that had held her consciousness for nearly 30 years. Father Thomas had wept when she asked this, but he had agreed. He had gone to the new bishop and had arranged it, and the bishop, perhaps understanding that he was witnessing something beyond his authority to judge, had granted permission. In her final days, Cecilia became aware of a strange doubling of consciousness. Part of her remained in the cell, aware of the cold stone, the thin light filtering through the window, the ragged sound of her own breathing. But another part of her seemed to have already slipped free, to be existing in a space that was not quite of this world. In this space, she encountered presences, not as visions exactly, but as a kind of knowing. She knew that her mother was there, and that her mother was no longer angry or confused but peaceful, accepting. She knew that Thomas was there, his presence warm and familiar. She knew too that there were others, other anchorites perhaps, other mystics who had sought the same dissolution of self that she had sought. There was a kind of communion happening, a gathering of those who had chosen to step outside of ordinary time and ordinary existence in order to touch something beyond. And underneath all of this, vast and patient and utterly impersonal, was the presence that she had first touched during that terrible first winter, the presence of a love that was not bound to any particular person or form, that required nothing from her, that asked only for her existence and her attention. She settled into it as one settles into sleep, and the distinction between internal and external, between self and not self, became increasingly irrelevant. She died in her sleep on a morning in late March. Father Thomas found her when he came to bring her food. She was lying on her narrow bench, her thin hands folded on her chest, her face peaceful in a way it had not been for many years. There was no struggle visible, no sign of suffering. She simply appeared to have laid down and stopped breathing, as naturally as one might stop playing an instrument and set it aside. The bishop came, and they performed the rituals that were required. But they kept their promise. They did not remove her from the cell. Instead, they sealed it completely, filling in the small windows that had been her only contact with the outside world. They turned the anchor hold into a tomb, and Cecilia remained where she had chosen to be, her body returning slowly to the stone and earth that had held her. In the years that followed, people began to speak of the cell with a kind of reverence. Pilgrims would come and press their hands against the sealed wall, whispering prayers, asking for intervention in their lives. Some claimed to experience visions or healings in her presence. Whether these experiences were genuine or imagined, a matter of faith or psychology, seemed somehow irrelevant. What mattered was that Cecilia had touched something real in her years of enclosure, something that continued to radiate outward, to touch the lives of those who came seeking it. The wall that sealed her in has survived nearly 700 years. The church that contains it has been altered and rebuilt many times, but the section of wall where the anchor hold existed remains. No one today knows with certainty which stones are the ones that enclosed Cecilia's final years. The cell itself is no longer visible. It has been absorbed into the body of the church, covered over by later construction, sealed off completely. But the stones remember. They hold within them the cold and the silence and the long, slow dissolution of a human consciousness into something larger than itself. And sometimes, on winter afternoons, people have reported hearing a kind of singing coming from that wall, a voice so faint it can barely be perceived, so ancient it seems to come from another world entirely. The years immediately following Cecilia's death seemed to pass in a strange suspension, as though the village itself had entered into a state of quiet mourning, though few among the living had truly known her. Father Thomas aged rapidly after finding her body, his hair turning white within months, his movements becoming slower and more deliberate. Those who knew him said that something essential had departed from him on that morning in late March, when he discovered her peaceful face. He continued to perform his duties with precision and devotion, but there was a quality of going through ritual, of inhabiting a role that no longer quite fit him. He had kept a private journal, something that was unusual for a parish priest in those days, and in it, he had written about Cecilia with a tenderness that suggested their relationship had run deeper than the ordinary interaction between confessor and penitent. "She was the holiest person I have ever known," he had written, "and yet she required nothing from me but attention and occasional kindness. In her presence, even separated as we were by stone and distance, I felt my own small faith enlarged, my ordinary life given meaning by proximity to her extraordinary commitment. I do not know if what she experienced in that cell was truly the presence of God, or if it was a kind of beautiful madness born from deprivation and solitude. Perhaps there is no difference. Perhaps holiness and madness are merely different words for the same breaking open of the ordinary boundaries of consciousness." The cell itself, sealed as it was, became the object of increasingly intense interest. In the first year after Cecilia's death, the bishop had formally prohibited any attempt to disturb or reopen it. The anchor hold was to remain sealed, he declared, a monument to her commitment and a sanctuary of prayer. But this official pronouncement seemed only to intensify the curiosity of the faithful. Within weeks, people began to report experiences at the wall. A woman who suffered from a persistent headache claimed that when she pressed her forehead against the stone, the pain dissolved. A child born blind experienced a sudden restoration of sight after her mother had placed her hands on the wall and whispered a prayer. An old man afflicted with a tremor that made his hands shake reported that the tremor ceased entirely after he spent a night in vigil against the sealed anchor hold. Some of these reports were undoubtedly exaggerations or misrememberings, the kind of stories that gather and transform as they pass from mouth to mouth. But others were witnessed by multiple people, recorded by clerics, difficult to dismiss as mere fancy. The bishop, skeptical as he was, found himself forced to acknowledge that something unusual was occurring. By the 5th year after Cecilia's death, he had authorized an official investigation into the possibility of her canonization. The investigation was conducted by a visiting bishop from a larger see, a learned man named Bishop Anselm, who had some experience with cases of potential sainthood. He arrived in the village in the autumn of 1309 and spent 3 weeks interviewing those who claimed to have experienced healings or visions at the sealed cell. He examined the wall himself, running his hands over the stone, studying the mortar, looking for any sign of tampering or deception. He spoke with Father Thomas for many hours, listening to the old priest's account of Cecilia's years in the cell, asking probing questions about her mental state, her motivations, and the authenticity of her spiritual experiences. What struck Bishop Anselm most powerfully, according to his written report, was the testimony of a woman named Margaret, who had been Cecilia's childhood friend. Margaret had come to the cell in the 3rd year after Cecilia's death, driven by a combination of grief and the desire to understand what had become of the girl she had once known. She had placed her hands on the sealed wall and had wept for a long time, remembering their childhood together, the games they had played, the futures they had imagined for themselves. When she finally left, she had reported experiencing a profound sense of peace, and more remarkably, a complete transformation of her understanding of Cecilia's choice. "I had thought she had wasted her life," Margaret had told the bishop. "I had thought that her enclosure was a kind of suicide, a deliberate rejection of the world and all that God had given her. But standing at that wall, I felt her presence more vividly than I had ever felt it when she was alive. It was as though she was still present, still alive in some way that transcended death. And I understood, finally, that she had not rejected the world out of bitterness or despair. She had chosen another form of presence, another way of being alive. She had become a doorway, a place where the boundary between this world and the next grows thin." Bishop Anselm had included Margaret's testimony in his formal report, along with accounts of the other healings and experiences reported at the cell. He had concluded that there was sufficient evidence of genuine holiness to recommend that Cecilia's case be forwarded to Rome for further consideration. However, he had also noted certain complications. Anchoritism was becoming increasingly rare and somewhat controversial in the church. Some bishops viewed it as an extreme practice, born more from spiritual pride or psychological damage than from genuine faith. There were questions about whether Cecilia's self-imposed deprivation could be justified theologically, whether her asceticism was compatible with Christian teachings about the body and the material world. The case never reached Rome. Church politics, the slow machinery of bureaucratic consideration, and a series of other demands on the attention of the ecclesiastical hierarchy combined to place Cecilia's cause in a kind of limbo. But in the village itself, the conviction had grown that she was indeed a saint, whether Rome ever acknowledged it or not. Over the years, the wall where she had been sealed became increasingly a pilgrimage destination. People came from neighboring villages and even from farther afield to pray at the anchor hold, to seek healing or guidance, or simply to touch the stones that had held such an extraordinary life. The church itself was gradually altered to accommodate these pilgrims. In the 1330s, a small stone chapel was built around the sealed anchor hold, creating a kind of shrine within the church. A small altar was placed before the wall, and candles were kept burning there continuously. The chapel was decorated with simple frescoes depicting scenes from Cecilia's life, though of course no one truly knew what she had looked like or how she had lived, so the paintings were largely imaginative, showing a serene woman in a cell, her face turned upward in prayer, light streaming down from an invisible source above. It was during this period of increasing veneration that something unexpected occurred. In the winter of 1342, more than 50 years after Cecilia's death, a severe storm swept through the region. The wind was extraordinary, gusts that seemed almost sentient in their violence, tearing off roofs, uprooting ancient trees, shattering windows. The church of St. Cuthbert sustained significant damage. Part of the roof collapsed, and water poured into the interior, causing extensive damage to the wooden furnishings and the stone itself. When the repairs began in the spring, the masons discovered something remarkable. The sealed anchor hold had been damaged in the storm. A portion of the wall had cracked, creating a small opening, barely large enough to put one's hand through, into the interior of the cell. The bishop was informed, and there followed several days of deliberation about what should be done. Should the opening be sealed again immediately? Should it be examined? Should an attempt be made to see inside? The debate might have continued indefinitely, but Father Matthew, who was now the elderly rector of the church, Father Thomas had died in 1327, 24 years after Cecilia, made a decision that was both courageous and controversial. In the early morning, before the bishop could issue a formal prohibition, he approached the damaged wall with a small candle. He held the light up to the crack and peered inside. What he saw, according to his testimony, was something that shook him profoundly. The interior of the cell appeared to be empty. There was no skeleton, no bones, no remains of a human body. There was only darkness and emptiness, as though Cecilia had never been there at all, or as though her body had been taken in the night by some force or presence unknown. But that was not quite accurate. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Father Matthew perceived something else, a kind of luminescence in the air, a faint glow that seemed almost to emanate from the stone itself. And he heard, though he could not have said with certainty whether he heard it with his ears or with some other faculty of perception, a sound like singing, the same faint, ancient melody that people had reported hearing at the wall for decades, now suddenly clearer, more present. When the bishop arrived and examined the opening, he saw what Father Matthew had seen, or rather, he saw the darkness and the emptiness, but he did not perceive the luminescence or hear the singing. The two men stood before the wall, separated by their different perceptions, and neither could convince the other of what he had experienced. The bishop's response was to order the wall sealed again immediately. Within days, skilled masons had been brought in, and the crack was carefully filled and plastered over, the damage repaired as completely as possible. The bishop issued a formal decree that the anchor hold was to be sealed and unexamined, that no further attempts were to be made to investigate its contents, and that anyone who attempted to disturb it would face severe ecclesiastical penalties. This decree, rather than discouraging further interest in the cell, seemed paradoxically to intensify it. The fact that it had been sealed again, combined with Father Matthew's report of the emptiness within, created a kind of mystery that captured the imagination of pilgrims and scholars alike. Had Cecilia's body been miraculously taken up into heaven? Had it simply dissolved, returning to dust more rapidly than ordinary human remains? Or had there never been a body at all? Had Cecilia herself been a kind of spiritual being, a vision made flesh, who had simply faded away when her earthly work was complete? These questions led to increased theological speculation and a kind of popular mythology growing up around Cecilia's memory. Poets composed verses about her. Traveling clerics told stories of her life, embellished and transformed with each telling. In some versions, she had lived in her cell for 50 years, or even 100. In others, she had been miraculously sustained without food or water, living on prayer alone. In still others, she had received frequent visitations from saints and angels, her cell becoming a kind of earthly heaven where the boundaries between this world and the next were made permeable by her faith. The historical Cecilia, the real woman who had chosen to be sealed into a cell for reasons that were complex and perhaps not even fully clear to herself, began to fade behind these accumulated layers of legend and interpretation. And yet, in some way, this was perhaps exactly what she would have desired. She had sought to transcend the personal, to dissolve the particular self into something universal. In becoming a legend, in being transformed into a symbol and a myth, she was achieving a kind of perpetuation that transcended the limitations of individual biography. The cell remained sealed for the next 4 centuries. The church was damaged and repaired multiple times, by fire in 1456, by the violence of religious upheaval during the Reformation, by the slow accumulation of age and weather. But the sealed anchor hold endured. Over time, the specific location of the cell became less precisely remembered. New walls were built that covered the original site. The small chapel that had been built in the 1330s was dismantled during the religious reformations of the 16th century, when the veneration of saints and relics fell out of favor. The frescoes depicting Cecilia's life were whitewashed over, covered by the iconoclastic fervor of the time. And yet the tradition persisted. Even as the exact location of the anchor hold became obscure, people continued to report experiences in that general area of the church. A coldness that seemed to have a presence, an intention. A sense of being observed, though kindly, from within the stone itself. Stories continued to be told in the village and beyond, about the woman who had chosen to be walled into a church and whose presence seemed somehow to continue indefinitely. Her consciousness, or her essence, or her soul. People used different words, depending on their own framework for understanding such things, seeming to maintain some kind of contact with the world beyond her sealed cell. In 1647, a scholar named Edmund Ashford, who had become interested in the history of anchoritism as a spiritual practice, traveled to the village and interviewed the current vicar about the legend of Cecilia. The vicar, a man named Robert Hartwell, a distant descendant, perhaps, of Cecilia's own family, had readily acknowledged that there was such a legend, though he expressed skepticism about its historical accuracy. However, he had also given Ashford access to the church records, including a journal kept by Father Matthew that had been preserved in the vestry. Ashford had spent several days reading through Father Matthew's careful, precise handwriting, and he had become convinced that the old priest had been describing something genuine, something that transcended the merely imaginative or superstitious. The detailed observations about the light, the singing, the sense of presence, these seemed to come from a man of genuine discernment, not prone to flights of fancy. Ashford had written an account of his findings and had published it in a small antiquarian journal, and this account, obscure though it was, had sparked renewed interest in Cecilia's story among scholars and mystics. In the years that followed, several attempts were made by various individuals to locate the precise location of the anchor hold and to reopen it. A Dominican friar in 1689 had managed to convince the church authorities to permit an excavation, and he had spent 3 weeks carefully removing stones and mortar from the wall that he believed contained the cell. But the work had revealed only solid stone, undifferentiated and continuous, with no sign of any hollow cavity within. The friar had concluded either that the location had been misidentified or that the story was entirely legendary. He had left the village disappointed, and the wall had been carefully repaired behind him. But then, in 1712, something extraordinary happened that would reignite interest in Cecilia's mystery and would transform her from a local legend into a figure of international significance among mystics and theologians. A young woman named Sarah Blackwood came to the village of St. Cuthbert's, claiming to be guided by visions to seek out Cecilia's cell. She was from London, the daughter of a prosperous merchant, educated beyond what was typical for women of her time, and possessed of a peculiar intensity that both attracted and disturbed those who encountered her. Sarah had claimed that Cecilia had appeared to her in dreams, calling her to come to the village and to bear witness to something, though she could not articulate precisely what. She had convinced her reluctant father to fund the journey, and she had arrived in the spring of 1712, thin and feverish from the trip, but animated by a kind of fierce determination. She had spent her first week simply walking the church, placing her hands on different sections of walls, sitting in silence for hours. The vicar of the time, a man named Thomas Witherspoon, had been alternately intrigued and concerned by her behavior. She seemed genuinely to be seeking something, but there was also something unsettling about her intensity, her refusal to eat or sleep normally, her almost manic quality of devotion. But then, on the 8th day of her vigil, something had occurred that the vicar himself had witnessed and documented. Sarah had been sitting in the western corner of the church, an area where many previous researchers had concluded the anchor hold was most likely to be located, when she had suddenly begun to sing. The vicar described the singing as unearthly, neither quite human nor entirely otherworldly, a melody that seemed to come from a source both inside and outside her body simultaneously. And as she sang, the vicar had reported seeing the stone itself seem to shimmer, as though the material substance of the wall was becoming slightly permeable, slightly less solid. He had seen, or believed he had seen, a figure standing on the other side of the stone, a woman in the robes of a medieval anchoress, her face serene, her hands folded in prayer. The figure had regarded Sarah with what the vicar described as infinite tenderness, and for a moment, the boundaries between the two women seemed to dissolve, as though they were merging into a single presence. Then the vision had faded. The stone had resumed its normal appearance of solid materiality. Sarah had stopped singing and had opened her eyes, looking dazed and profoundly moved. She had turned to the vicar and had said simply, "She is here. She has always been here. She will always be here." The vicar, shaken by what he had witnessed, had carefully documented the experience in the church records. He had concluded that he had experienced a kind of shared hallucination with Sarah, born from her intensity and his own susceptibility to suggestion. But he had also noted in his private journal that the experience had been profoundly real to him, in a way that transcended rational explanation. "I do not know what I saw," he had written, "but I know that I saw something. And whatever it was, it has fundamentally altered my understanding of what is possible, of what may exist in the spaces between the material and the invisible, between death and life, between history and the eternal present." Sarah had remained in the village for 3 months. She had spent much of that time in prayer and fasting, becoming progressively more insubstantial, as though she too were being drawn into some kind of communion with the sealed cell. The vicar had become increasingly concerned about her physical health, and he had tried to convince her to eat and to moderate her ascetic practices. But Sarah had refused, saying that she was doing what she had been called to do, that she was meeting Cecilia on the other side of the wall, and that her physical body was becoming less important to her with each passing day. In the end, her father had come to retrieve her, alarmed by letters from the vicar describing her deteriorating condition. Sarah had been taken back to London, where she had spent the rest of her life in a kind of quiet contemplation, never quite fully returning to ordinary consciousness, but also never fully succumbing to what might have been diagnosed as madness or mental illness. She had lived another 43 years, mostly in seclusion, and when she died at the age of 71, she had left behind extensive journals and writings in which she described her ongoing communion with Cecilia. These writings, discovered after her death and published in fragments over the subsequent decades, had attracted the attention of mystics, scholars, and theologians across Europe. They painted a picture of Cecilia as something more than a historical figure, as an ongoing presence, a kind of spiritual anchor or beacon for those sensitive enough to perceive it. Sarah had described detailed conversations with Cecilia, received teachings about the nature of consciousness and the transcendence of individual selfhood, and reported receiving healing and guidance for various individuals who came seeking it. Whether Sarah was genuinely in communication with some continuation of Cecilia's consciousness, or whether she was engaged in an elaborate and deeply meaningful act of imagination and projection, became the subject of intense scholarly debate. But what seemed undeniable was the power of her writings, the way they seemed to touch something real in those who read them. People reported having experiences of the divine while reading Sarah's accounts. Some claimed to have been healed of various physical and psychological ailments. Others simply reported a sense of profound peace, a feeling of connection to something transcendent and timeless. By the end of the 18th century, Cecilia's story had become something of an international phenomenon among certain circles of spiritual seekers and scholars. There were attempts to locate her cell anew, to open it, to see what remained of her physical form. But all such attempts had been thwarted, either by the refusal of the church authorities to permit excavation, or by the simple fact that, despite extensive searching, no one could definitively locate where the original opening had been sealed. The church itself had undergone significant restoration work in 1805, and during this work, the workers had indeed found what appeared to be the location of the anchor hold. But by this time, the wall had been rebuilt multiple times, covered over by later construction, absorbed into the broader structure of the building. The original stones that had enclosed Cecilia could no longer be distinguished from the rest of the wall. The cell, if it still existed at all, was now hermetically sealed not just by the masons who had sealed it in her death, but by centuries of subsequent construction and alteration. And perhaps many came to believe this was exactly as it should be. The physical cell had become less important than the spiritual reality it represented. What mattered was not whether one could touch the stones that had held her, but rather the fact that she herself seemed to have transcended those stones, to exist now in a realm that was not bounded by space or time. The 19th century saw a profound transformation in how Cecilia's story was understood and transmitted. The age of Romantic poetry and intense interest in the medieval period meant that her narrative found new audiences and new interpreters. In 1823, a poet named John Keats, no relation to the more famous Romantic poet of the same era, published a long narrative poem titled The Anchoress, a tale of stone and spirit, which became unexpectedly popular and introduced Cecilia's story to a much broader readership. Keats's poem was not historically accurate, but it was profoundly moving, depicting Cecilia as a tragic figure who had sacrificed personal happiness for a higher calling, a kind of medieval saint struggling against the limitations of her own flesh and the indifference of a world that could not understand her. The poem had sparked letters to editors, scholarly articles, and eventually a kind of minor scholarly industry around Cecilia's historical reality. Who had she really been? What had truly driven her to the cell? Had she been mad, or had she been genuinely experiencing the divine? Historians and theologians began to examine the surviving documentary evidence with renewed intensity. Father Thomas's journal was rediscovered in an archive in Oxford and was published in full for the first time in 1847. Father Matthew's more fragmentary records were located and collated with other sources. The testimonies of pilgrims and those who had claimed healings at her cell were compiled and analyzed. Slowly, a more complex and nuanced picture began to emerge of a real woman, not a saint exactly, but a person of genuine spiritual seriousness who had made an extraordinary choice and had lived with the consequences of that choice with remarkable dignity and authenticity. But alongside this scholarly recovery of the historical Cecilia came a growing contemporary movement of individuals who claimed to be in direct communication with her spiritual presence. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, spiritualists and mystics reported receiving messages from Cecilia, often through automatic writing or mediumistic trances. These messages were usually abstract and philosophical, speaking of the dissolution of self, the transcendence of time, the unity underlying all existence. Some were published in obscure spiritualist journals. Others were kept private by those who received them, treasured as personal communications from a being who seemed to exist in a realm beyond ordinary death. One particularly significant figure in this regard was a woman named Margaret Ashford, who became convinced in 1891, at the age of 23, that she was receiving communications from Cecilia through dreams and meditative experiences. Margaret had been born into an educated family with antiquarian interests. She was, in fact, a descendant of Edmund Ashford, the scholar who had first published an account of Cecilia's story in the 17th century, and she brought to her spiritual work a rigor and intellectual seriousness that was unusual for the spiritualist movement of her time. Margaret had spent decades carefully recording her experiences and communications, filling numerous notebooks with her accounts. Unlike Sarah Blackwood's journals, which had been highly emotional and ecstatic in tone, Margaret's writings were measured and analytical, attempting to distinguish between what she believed to be genuine communication and what she recognized as her own imagination or psychological projection. She had written, "It is difficult to know where the boundary lies between receiving and creating, between channeling and imagining. Perhaps the distinction itself is false. Perhaps when we open ourselves to receive messages from beyond ordinary consciousness, what we are really doing is creating a space where our own deepest understanding can emerge, dressed in the garments of an external source." Margaret had visited the church at St. Cuthbert's multiple times over the course of her life, placing her hands on the walls where she believed the anchor hold to be, sitting in long vigils of prayer and meditation. She had never experienced the dramatic visions that Sarah Blackwood had reported, but she had described a kind of gentle, continuous presence, a warmth, a sense of companionship, an invisible presence that seemed to offer guidance and counsel on matters both spiritual and practical. In one of her later notebooks, written when she was in her 70s, Margaret had reflected on what she believed she had learned from Cecilia over the decades of their communion. She teaches me that the dissolution of self is not a death but a transformation. She shows me that the cell she inhabited was not a prison but a doorway, and that this doorway remains eternally open for those who know how to perceive it. She reminds me that time itself is a kind of illusion, that a life lived in radical presence and attention, even if it is lived in a small sealed space, touches eternity itself. Most importantly, she teaches me that the work of the Spirit is not about achievement or attainment, not about reaching some distant goal, but about deepening one's presence to what is already here, already given, already complete. Margaret had died in 1967 at the age of 98, and her extensive notebooks had been bequeathed to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, where they remain to this day, part of a growing archive of materials related to Cecilia's story. Scholars have debated endlessly whether Margaret's experiences represented genuine paranormal communication, or were simply the product of a sensitive and imaginative mind, engaging in a kind of spiritual dialogue with history. But what seems undeniable is the authenticity of Margaret's spiritual seeking, the genuineness of her commitment to understanding what Cecilia might represent, and the transformative effect her work with Cecilia's memory had on her own life. The 20th century brought new challenges to the preservation and interpretation of Cecilia's memory. The church at St. Cuthbert's suffered significant damage during the Second World War, when the village was caught in the path of bombing raids. The south wall, where the anchor hold was believed to be located, sustained a direct hit from a bomb in 1941. The explosion had destroyed much of that section of the wall, exposing the interior to the elements and creating extensive structural damage. When the repairs began after the war, there had been some hope that the bombing might have finally revealed the location of the cell. But when the damaged section was carefully excavated and examined, the workers had found only solid stone, layer upon layer of stone, with no cavity or hollow space that could have been the anchor hold. The modern vicar at the time, a man named Charles Willoughby, who was sympathetic to the historical tradition surrounding Cecilia, had overseen the work carefully. He had documented that the medieval mortar used to seal the original cell could not be distinguished from the medieval mortar used in the construction of other sections of the wall, and that subsequent repairs and rebuildings had so thoroughly obliterated any visible distinction that it was impossible to determine where exactly the cell had been. In his report on the restoration work, Willoughby had written, "We have sought to find the physical remains of the cell, believing that in opening the stone, we might recover some tangible connection to the woman who once inhabited it. But it appears that the stone itself has kept its secrets. Whether this is because the cell was sealed so thoroughly that it cannot be found, or whether it is because the very distinction between the location of the cell and the rest of the wall has been erased by time and human intervention, we cannot say. Perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps Cecilia's work was precisely to teach us that the sacred is not located in any particular place, but rather in the quality of presence and attention we bring to any place. The restoration of the church, completed in 1952, had included the construction of a small memorial chapel in what was believed to be the approximate location of the original anchor hold. This chapel was much more modest than the one that had been built in the medieval period and dismantled during the Reformation. It contained only a simple stone altar, a wooden bench for kneeling, and a plaque that read, "In memory of Cecilia Hartwell, 1257-1304, who dwelt in this place in contemplation and prayer, seeking the divine presence in solitude and silence." The plaque was historically inaccurate. Cecilia's dates were approximate at best, and the language was generic and somewhat anodyne, lacking the specificity and power of her actual story. But it served a purpose. It acknowledged that something significant had happened at this location, that a human life of unusual spiritual seriousness had been lived here, and that her memory remained worthy of honor and remembrance. By the late 20th century, interest in Cecilia's story had undergone a significant transformation. The spiritualist fascination with her had largely faded, replaced by more secular historical and psychological interest. Scholars began to examine her experience through the lens of medieval history, psychology, gender studies, and religious studies. There were attempts to understand her choice through the frameworks of modern psychology. Was she depressed? Was she responding to trauma from her near drowning? Was her anchoritism a form of dissociation, or a way of coping with what we might now recognize as PTSD? These modern interpretative frameworks were not necessarily wrong, but they also seemed to miss something essential about Cecilia's experience. They attempted to reduce her choice to understandable psychological mechanisms, to make her sensible within contemporary frameworks of understanding. But perhaps the point was precisely that she could not be made fully sensible, that her choice represented something that transcended the categories through which we normally understand human motivation and meaning. In 1989, on the 700th anniversary of Cecilia's enclosure, the church at St. Cuthbert's held a commemoration service. The vicar at the time, a progressive woman named Elizabeth Morton, who was one of the first female priests in the Church of England, had organized a symposium that brought together historians, theologians, mystics, and scholars from around the world. They had gathered to discuss Cecilia's life, her significance, and what she might teach contemporary spiritual seekers about the nature of contemplation, solitude, and the search for transcendence. The symposium had been remarkable in bringing together people who approached Cecilia from radically different angles. There were dry academic historians who viewed her primarily as a window into medieval religious practice. There were theologians who engaged seriously with the questions her life raised about the nature of faith and the possibility of encountering the divine. There were contemplative practitioners, Benedictine monks, Zen teachers, Sufi mystics, who saw in her story a kind of universal teaching about the nature of spiritual practice. And there were descendants of the village who came simply to honor the memory of a remarkable ancestor, to acknowledge that something profound and moving had happened in their church, even if they could not fully articulate what that something was. One of the most memorable moments of the symposium had come during the closing ceremony, when a contemporary musician named David White had composed and performed a piece inspired by Cecilia's story. The music had been sparse and haunting, employing long tones and silences in a way that seemed to invoke the quality of Cecilia's own silence. The performance had lasted nearly an hour, and many in the audience had reported that during the performance, they had experienced a kind of altered state of consciousness, a dissolution of the boundary between themselves and the music, a sense of touching something timeless and transcendent. In the years after the symposium, the church at St. Cuthbert's had gradually transformed into a kind of international pilgrimage destination. People came from all over the world to sit in the memorial chapel, to meditate before the sealed wall, to pray for healing or guidance, or simply to experience the sense of presence that many reported at the location. The vicar, Elizabeth Morton, had worked to welcome these pilgrims while also maintaining appropriate boundaries and ensuring that the church could continue to function as a living parish church rather than becoming simply a historical monument. She had established a guest book in the memorial chapel, and over the course of 2 decades, thousands of people had written their reflections. Some wrote of healings they had experienced. Some wrote of profound spiritual insights. Some simply wrote gratitude for the knowledge that such a commitment to spiritual practice was possible, gratitude for the inspiration Cecilia's life provided, gratitude for the sense of connection they felt at the place where she had lived. Reading through these entries, one could encounter the full diversity of human spiritual seeking. A woman from Japan wrote of how Cecilia's story had helped her understand her own desire for a deeper meditation practice. A man from Brazil wrote of how learning about Cecilia had helped him make sense of a calling he felt to leave his ordinary life and pursue a path of spiritual dedication. A child wrote in careful printing, "I think Cecilia was brave. She did what she believed in even when it was hard. That makes me want to be brave too." An elderly woman who had visited the church for 50 years wrote simply, "She is still here. I feel her every time I come. She helps me know that I am never alone." By the turn of the 21st century, Cecilia's story had become something of a global phenomenon, retold and reinterpreted in countless contexts. There had been novels, plays, films, and artworks inspired by her life. She had been the subject of academic dissertations and popular books. Her image appeared on prayer cards and meditation guides. Some contemporary monasteries and contemplative communities had adopted her story as part of their spiritual tradition, using her life as a kind of teaching story about the nature of commitment and practice. And yet, for all this contemporary attention, the fundamental mystery of Cecilia remained. The sealed cell had never been opened. No remains had ever been recovered. No definitive proof of her existence had ever been found beyond the fragmentary documentary evidence from the medieval period. In some ways, the very impossibility of accessing her, the way she seemed to elude all attempts at investigation or verification, had become part of what made her so powerful as a figure. She had become, in a sense, what she had always intended to become, a presence rather than a person, a teaching rather than a biography, a mystery rather than a solved problem. She had successfully transcended the ordinary limitations of individual identity and had entered into a kind of universal symbolic realm where she could speak to people across centuries and cultures, where her specific medieval experience could be universalized into teachings about consciousness, commitment, and the search for transcendence. In 2004, a contemporary artist named James Turrell, known for his work with light and space, was commissioned to create an installation at St. Cuthbert's Church to honor Cecilia's memory. Turrell had spent weeks at the church, meditating at the memorial chapel, studying the light as it filtered through the windows, attempting to understand the quality of presence that people reported at the location. He had created an installation that used carefully calibrated light and architectural interventions to make the space around the sealed wall perceptually ambiguous, to create an environment where the normal boundaries between inside and outside, solid and permeable, seemed to dissolve. The installation had been temporary, lasting only 6 months, but it had attracted pilgrims and art enthusiasts from around the world. Many had reported profound experiences of altered consciousness within the installation, a sense of touching something beyond ordinary perception. When it was finally dismantled, those who had experienced it felt a sense of loss, as though they had been granted temporary access to a realm that was normally hidden, and now that access was being withdrawn. But Turrell, in an interview after the installation was removed, had said something that seemed to capture something essential about Cecilia and her ongoing significance. What I was trying to create was a space that acknowledged the limits of ordinary perception. Cecilia's story is fundamentally about stepping outside of ordinary perception, about choosing to live in a way that most people cannot understand, in a space that ordinary consciousness cannot quite reach. I think what she discovered, sealed in her cell, was that there are other modes of consciousness available to us, other ways of being present in the world, if we are willing to pay the price of stepping outside of the ordinary. The installation was an attempt to create a temporary pathway into that other mode of consciousness, not as a replacement for Cecilia's own extreme practice, but as a kind of gesture toward what she was attempting, a recognition that what she was reaching for is real, even if it exists in a realm that normally remains invisible to us. The early decades of the 21st century brought new technological possibilities for investigating Cecilia's mystery. Yet paradoxically, these technologies seem to reinforce rather than resolve the enigma at the heart of her story. In 2011, a team of archaeologists and engineers equipped with ground-penetrating radar conducted an extensive survey of the church's south wall in an attempt to locate the anchor hold. The GPR imaging revealed the presence of numerous cavities and structural variations within the wall, but the data was inconclusive. There appeared to be a region of the wall where the internal structure was somewhat different from the surrounding stone, but whether this represented the remains of Cecilia's cell or simply variations in the medieval construction technique could not be definitively determined. The vicar at the time, a thoughtful man named Michael Chen, who had been raised as a Buddhist before converting to Christianity, had made the decision not to permit any excavation based on the GPR findings. He had argued that the ambiguity itself was important, that the inability to definitively locate or access the cell was more valuable than any attempt to resolve the mystery through invasive investigation. Cecilia's gift to us, he had written in the parish newsletter, may be precisely that she remains unknowable, inaccessible, mysterious. In a world where we are constantly attempting to investigate, categorize, and fully understand everything, Cecilia offers us something different. She offers us the possibility of encountering what cannot be fully known, of touching what cannot be grasped, of finding meaning in what remains ultimately mysterious. This perspective seemed to resonate with many contemporary spiritual seekers who came to the church. The impossibility of accessing Cecilia's remains, rather than being frustrating, seemed to many to be spiritually significant. It prevented the relic from becoming merely an object of curiosity or historical study. It required that one approach Cecilia through imagination, through meditation, through a kind of spiritual intuition rather than through physical proof. It demanded, in a sense, a surrender of the modern desire to verify and control knowledge. Around this same time, a remarkable discovery emerged from an entirely different quarter. A scholar of medieval literature named Dr. Sarah Winters, working in the archives of a monastery in France, had discovered a manuscript dating from the late 15th century that appeared to be an account of Cecilia written by someone who claimed to have been her spiritual advisor. The manuscript was written in a mixture of Latin and Middle English and had clearly been copied multiple times, creating numerous transcription errors and ambiguities. But careful paleographic and linguistic analysis suggested that the underlying text might date from the early 14th century, only a decade or two after Cecilia's death. The manuscript was fragmentary and difficult to parse, but it contained details about Cecilia's inner experience that matched in certain respects with what Father Thomas and Father Matthew had reported, while also providing new information. The unknown author described Cecilia's gradual transformation from a woman seeking expiation through mortification to someone who had transcended the need for such practices, who had moved into a state of pure presence and acceptance. He described her visions in greater detail, though he emphasized that she herself had been skeptical of their reality, viewing them as potentially projections of her own mind, rather than genuine encounters with the divine. Most strikingly, the manuscript contained a passage in which the author, whom Sarah Winters hypothesized might have been a visiting bishop or senior ecclesiastic, reflected on what Cecilia's practice might mean for the broader question of spiritual authenticity. Many come to the cell seeking signs and wonders, expecting the anchoress to manifest extraordinary powers or to receive revelations that can be verified and examined. But the true work of such a one is often the most subtle and invisible. It is the work of consciousness itself, the slow transformation of awareness that occurs when one remains in radical presence to one's own existence. Whether the visions she reports are genuine revelations from God or are simply the mind revealing to itself the contents of its own depths, the effect is the same: a deepening of consciousness, a transformation of being. And perhaps this distinction between external revelation and internal insight is itself a false one, born from our dualistic way of thinking. Perhaps God speaks through the depths of consciousness itself, and to access those depths is to access the divine. This manuscript had created significant excitement in both scholarly and spiritual circles. It seemed to provide more direct evidence that Cecilia's experience had been as profound and as transformative as later accounts had suggested, while also raising important questions about the nature of religious experience and the possibility of distinguishing between genuine encounters with the transcendent and psychological or imaginative experiences. But perhaps the most significant development in the interpretation of Cecilia's story came not from historical research or spiritual practice, but from the emergence of new forms of contemplative practice that drew explicitly on the medieval anchoritic tradition. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating through the early 21st century, there had been a revival of interest in the practice of hermitage and strict contemplative withdrawal among both Christian and non-Christian practitioners. Some individuals, inspired in part by Cecilia's story, had chosen to undertake their own versions of radical seclusion, not necessarily by being physically sealed into cells, but through extended periods of retreat and near total withdrawal from ordinary social contact. One particularly significant figure in this movement was a contemporary American monk named Brother Thomas, who had spent 15 years in various Buddhist and Christian monasteries before choosing to undertake a 3-year solitary retreat in a small hermitage in the mountains of Colorado. During this retreat, which he had documented in careful journals, Brother Thomas had explicitly engaged with Cecilia's story as a kind of teaching guide. He had read Father Thomas's journal repeatedly, had meditated on the accounts of Cecilia's experience, and had used her life as a kind of reference point for his own exploration of extreme solitude and contemplative practice. In an interview after completing his retreat, Brother Thomas had said, "What Cecilia teaches me is that solitude is not escape, but rather a kind of deepening. When we remove ourselves from the constant stimulation and demands of ordinary social life, we are forced to encounter what is actually here, our own minds, our own consciousness, the immediate reality of existence itself. This can be terrifying at first, because our ordinary social structures protect us from having to encounter these things directly. But if we persist, if we develop the courage and discipline to remain present to what arises, then we discover something remarkable. We discover that the very things we were trying to escape from, boredom, loneliness, fear, are themselves the gateways to a much deeper understanding of what it means to be alive. Brother Thomas's account of his retreat had become something of a contemporary classic in contemplative circles, frequently cited alongside Cecilia's story as an example of the possibility and the value of extreme solitude for spiritual practice. His work had inspired others to undertake similar retreats, creating a kind of contemporary movement of radical contemplative practice that, while not literally emulating Cecilia's anchoritism, was clearly drawing on the model she had established. Yet alongside this contemporary revival of interest in contemplative seclusion, there had also emerged thoughtful critiques of the practice, including critiques that engaged specifically with Cecilia's story. Some feminist scholars had argued that Cecilia's choice, while apparently free, had actually been constrained by the limited options available to women in medieval society. A woman who did not wish to marry had essentially two choices: become a nun or find some other form of religious expression. Anchoritism, in this analysis, represented not so much a free choice as a kind of constrained option within a patriarchal system that limited women's possibilities. The fact that Cecilia had achieved such profound spiritual experiences did not negate the fact that her choices had been shaped by these structural limitations. Other scholars had raised questions about whether the celebration of Cecilia's extreme asceticism was healthy or desirable. In a contemporary world where eating disorders, self-harm, and other forms of self-injurious behavior were recognized as serious psychological problems, was it appropriate to celebrate someone who had deliberately starved herself and exposed herself to extreme cold? Might not the contemporary revival of interest in such practices be potentially harmful, encouraging people with underlying psychological vulnerabilities toward self-destructive behavior? These critiques were important and had to be taken seriously, but they also seemed to many observers to miss something essential about what Cecilia was attempting. The question was not whether her choice would be a good one for everyone, or whether all of the motivations behind her choice were psychologically healthy. The question was whether her chosen path represented a genuine spiritual possibility, a real way of approaching transcendence and transformation that, while not appropriate or desirable for most people, remained a valid option for those who felt genuinely called to it. In 2019, a contemporary documentary filmmaker named Olivia Rothstein had spent a year visiting St. Cuthbert's Church, interviewing pilgrims and scholars, and attempting to create a film that would capture the essence of Cecilia's story and its continuing significance. The resulting film, titled The Sealed Cell, Cecilia's Legacy, had premiered at several international film festivals and had found a significant audience both among religious communities and among broader audiences interested in medieval history and contemplative spirituality. The film was notable for its refusal to resolve the ambiguities at the heart of Cecilia's story. Rather than presenting a definitive account of who she was and what she had experienced, the film constructed a kind of polyphonic narrative, presenting multiple perspectives and interpretations without attempting to privilege one over the others. There was footage of the sealed wall at St. Cuthbert's, of contemporary pilgrims praying before it, of scholarly discussions about the historical evidence. There were dramatic reenactments of key moments in Cecilia's life: her near drowning in the river, her decision to be sealed into the cell, her final illness. There were interviews with contemporary spiritual practitioners who were engaged in their own forms of radical practice. But what gave the film its power was a quality of deep reverence combined with honest uncertainty. Rothstein clearly believed that something real and important had happened at St. Cuthbert's, that Cecilia's life and death represented genuine spiritual achievement, but she also refused to make claims she could not substantiate. The film's final sequence showed the sealed wall in various kinds of light: morning light, afternoon light, evening light, moonlight. And in each instance, the stones seemed to shift and change their appearance, sometimes appearing solid and impenetrable, sometimes seeming to shimmer with an almost translucent quality. The narration, spoken in a woman's voice, simply said, "We may never know with certainty what Cecilia experienced in her cell. We may never be able to prove whether her visions were genuine communications from the divine or manifestations of her own consciousness. But we know that something profound happened here, something that has continued to resonate across 7 centuries, touching the hearts and minds of those who have heard her story. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the meaning of her life lies not in what we can definitively establish about her, but in what continues to be revealed through her, through the ongoing encounter between her story and those who approach it seeking truth." The film had won several awards at film festivals and had attracted significant attention from academic and spiritual communities. But more importantly, it had seemed to capture something essential about the contemporary relationship to Cecilia's story: a kind of reverent uncertainty, a willingness to be moved and transformed by a mystery that could not be fully resolved or understood. In 2023, on the 719th anniversary of Cecilia's enclosure, the church at St. Cuthbert's held another major commemoration event. This time, rather than focusing primarily on historical scholarship, the event brought together contemplative practitioners from various traditions: Christian monastics, Zen Buddhist teachers, Sufi mystics, Hindu yogis, secular meditation practitioners, to explore what Cecilia's life and practice might teach about the universal human capacity for transcendence and transformation. The vicar at this time was a woman named Rebecca Lewis, who had studied theology and also trained extensively in contemplative practice. She had approached the organization of the commemoration with careful thought about how to honor Cecilia's memory, while also recognizing that her story had become something that transcended its original medieval Christian context. The commemoration included traditional Christian liturgy, but it also included meditation from the Zen tradition, Sufi poetry and chanting, and presentations from secular scholars of consciousness and contemplative practice. One of the most moving moments came during a session devoted to contemporary accounts of extended solitude and its spiritual effects. A woman named Dr. Lisa Morrison, who was a neuroscientist as well as a long-time meditation practitioner, had presented research on the neurological effects of extended contemplative practice. She had described studies showing that long-term meditation practitioners developed measurable changes in brain structure and function, particularly in areas associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-referential processing. While she had been careful not to make causal claims or to suggest that these neurological changes were the cause rather than the correlate of spiritual transformation, her work suggested that the kinds of experiences Cecilia had reported, the dissolution of the self, the sense of timelessness, the perception of a larger consciousness, had measurable neural correlates. "What intrigues me about Cecilia's story," Morrison had said, "is that she was essentially engaging in a form of intensive contemplative practice 700 years before we had any scientific understanding of what that practice does to the human brain. She had no way of knowing about neural plasticity or the effects of sustained attention on cortical reorganization. She was simply following what she understood as a spiritual calling, and in doing so, she was submitting herself to a process that we now know involves profound transformation of consciousness at every level: neurological, psychological, and spiritual. Whether we interpret these changes through a scientific framework or a religious framework, the transformation itself seems to be real. This intersection of contemporary neuroscience with medieval mysticism had struck many observers as emblematic of something important about how Cecilia's story continued to speak across different frameworks of understanding. She was not simply a historical figure to be studied, not simply a spiritual exemplar to be emulated, but a kind of human frontier marker, evidence that consciousness itself is far stranger and more capacious than our ordinary, everyday experience of it suggests. In the years leading up to 2024, there had been increasing discussion among scholars and spiritual practitioners about what might be called the universalization of Cecilia's story. She had become less a specifically Christian medieval figure and more a kind of universal symbol of the human capacity for radical transformation through contemplative practice. Her story was being retold in contexts far removed from medieval Christianity, in contemporary Buddhist communities, in secular mindfulness programs, in artistic and literary works that engaged with her narrative without necessarily engaging with the religious framework in which it originated. This universalization had its strengths and its limitations. On one hand, it allowed Cecilia's story to touch and inspire a vastly broader range of people than would have been possible if her narrative had remained confined within a specifically Christian or medieval context. People with no particular religious commitment could still find her story meaningful, could still be moved by what it represented about human possibility and the search for transcendence. On the other hand, there was something potentially lost in this process of universalization. The specificity of Cecilia's medieval Christian context, the particular theological frameworks through which she understood her own experience, the concrete historical and social conditions that had shaped her choice. These elements tended to become flattened or abstracted as her story was adapted for contemporary audiences. There was a risk of turning her into a kind of universal symbol that meant everything, and therefore meant nothing in particular. A figure so generalized that she ceased to have any specific content or particularity. Some contemporary scholars had pushed back against this tendency, arguing for the importance of recovering Cecilia's historical specificity and resisting the urge to make her story serve contemporary purposes. A medieval historian named Margaret Ashby had written, "We must resist the temptation to turn Cecilia into a contemporary figure who simply happens to have lived in the medieval period. She was not a modern person trapped in a medieval body. She was genuinely medieval in her theology, her cosmology, her way of understanding self and world. To the extent that we can recover her as she actually was, rooted in her particular historical moment, we honor her more truly than if we simply use her story as a kind of blank screen onto which we project our contemporary concerns." Yet even as Ashby and others made these arguments for historical specificity, the process of Cecilia's universalization and contemporary reinterpretation seemed to continue almost inevitably. Each new generation, each new cultural context, seemed to find in Cecilia's story something that spoke to its own preoccupations and questions. In that sense, perhaps she was achieving exactly what she had sought to achieve through her anchoricism, a transcendence of the particular self and particular moment in time, an entry into a realm where meaning could be perpetually regenerated and renewed through the encounter between her story and those who encountered it. In the winter of 2024, on a gray afternoon when snow lay thick upon the ground around St. Cuthbert's Church, a young woman named Emma stood before the memorial chapel and placed her hands against the sealed stone wall. She was 26 years old, a software engineer from London who had come to the village after reading Olivia Rothstein's film, drawn by something she could not quite name, a hunger, perhaps, or a recognition that the ordinary life she had been living was not touching something essential that she needed to touch. Emma had spent the previous night in vigil at the wall, sitting in silence from dusk until dawn, and in that long darkness, something had shifted in her perception. She had not experienced visions, had not heard voices, had not received any dramatic confirmation of the transcendent. Instead, she had simply found herself becoming still, her mind becoming quiet, the constant chatter of thought and emotion gradually subsiding into something deeper. And in that stillness, she had felt what countless pilgrims before her had felt, a presence that was both utterly impersonal and infinitely tender, a kind of attention that noticed her completely while asking nothing of her, demanding nothing, offering only a recognition of her existence and her worth. Now, in the pale morning light, with her hands still pressed against the stone, Emma understood something about why Cecilia had made her choice. It was not, as she had previously believed, about escape or punishment or a rejection of life. It was about finding a place where one could be fully present, fully alive, without the constant distraction and fragmentation that the ordinary world demanded. It was about discovering that in stepping outside of time, one entered a different kind of temporality, not the abstract, measured time of clocks and calendars, but the deep time of consciousness itself, where moments could expand to contain eternities and eternities could be compressed into moments. She did not know if she would become an actress herself. That path seemed increasingly anachronistic, unsuited to the contemporary world. But she knew that something in her had been fundamentally altered by this encounter with Cecilia's story, and with the place where Cecilia had lived. She would return to her ordinary life, her job, her apartment in London, her relationships with family and friends. But she would carry with her now a different understanding of what was possible, a knowledge that there existed these extraordinary paths of human endeavor, these ways of being alive that transcended the conventional boundaries of what life could be. And perhaps she thought that was enough. Perhaps Cecilia's gift to the world was precisely this: the knowledge that such commitment was possible, that such transcendence was real, that the sacred could be encountered not in grand external gestures, but in the patient, humble deepening of presence and attention. Cecilia had lived her extraordinary life not in order to be celebrated or remembered, but simply because she had heard a calling that made every other possibility secondary. And in living that calling with complete authenticity, she had become a kind of beacon, a living proof that human consciousness could reach beyond its ordinary limitations. The sealed cell had never been opened. The mystery of what remained within those walls had never been solved. The precise location of the anchor hold had been lost and found and lost again, buried beneath centuries of construction and renovation. And yet Cecilia remained, not as a historical figure, not as a verified fact, but as a presence, a teaching, a question that each generation had to encounter and answer according to its own understanding. She had sought dissolution, and she had found it. But in dissolving the boundaries of her individual self, she had somehow become more present, more influential, more real than countless people who had lived more conventional lives and left more obvious marks upon the world. Her body had returned to dust 700 years ago, sealed within stone that had become indistinguishable from all other stone. But her consciousness, or whatever one wished to call the presence that people continued to encounter at her cell, the inspiration that continued to move those who heard her story, seemed somehow to have transcended the limitations of individual mortality. In the spring of that same year, the seeds from plants growing around the church at St. Cuthbert's were collected and distributed to pilgrims who visited the memorial chapel. An elderly woman named Dorothy, who had been visiting the cell every month for 30 years, received a small packet of seeds and carried them back to her garden in Cornwall. She planted them in soil enriched with compost she had made from the leaves and grass of previous years, tending them carefully through the growing season. By late summer, the plants, a variety of wildflowers native to the church's grounds, had bloomed in her garden, creating a small island of color and life. Dorothy sat among them on warm evenings, and in their presence, she felt connected to the thousands of people across centuries who had stood at that wall, seeking what Cecilia had found. She felt connected to Cecilia herself, not as a historical figure, but as a living presence that seemed to persist in these humble flowers, in the space of contemplation they created, in the way they drew attention and reverence and peace. And in that connection, Dorothy understood something essential about what Cecilia had been attempting: the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, the recognition that consciousness is not confined within individual bodies, but is somehow woven through all of existence, connecting all beings across time and space in a web of mutual presence and attention. The stone wall at St. Cuthbert's church still stands. The sealed anchor hold remains unknown, its exact location a matter of uncertainty and scholarly debate. Pilgrims continue to visit, to place their hands upon the stone, to sit in silence and prayer. Some report profound spiritual experiences. Others report simply a sense of peace, a quieting of the constant mental activity that ordinarily characterizes human consciousness. Some report nothing extraordinary, but find nonetheless that they cannot help but return, year after year, drawn by something they cannot name. And somewhere within that stone, or perhaps beyond it, in a realm that transcends the distinction between physical and non-physical, between time and timelessness, Cecilia remains. Not as a ghost, not as an external presence, but as a teaching, a possibility, a demonstration of what human consciousness might become if it were willing to pay the price of radical commitment and absolute presence. She had walled herself in, seeking to dissolve the boundaries between self and the divine. Instead, she had discovered that the boundaries had never truly existed, that what she had understood as a wall separating her from God was simply ignorance, and that in the removal of that ignorance through years of patient practice and deepening awareness, she had become indistinguishable from that which she sought. The snow continues to fall each winter, covering the grounds of St. Cuthbert's church, erasing the distinctions between past and present, between the medieval world in which Cecilia lived and the contemporary world in which pilgrims still come to seek her. And in that erasure, in that dissolution of temporal boundaries, Cecilia's work continues, not as history, not as biography, but as an ongoing invitation to those who encounter her story to consider what might be possible if they too were willing to step beyond the ordinary boundaries of human existence. The cell remains sealed. The mystery remains unresolved. And in that very irresolution lies the secret of Cecilia's continuing power. She cannot be definitively known, cannot be reduced to explanation, cannot be possessed or controlled. She remains forever just beyond our grasp, inviting us to reach towards something that transcends our ordinary categories of understanding, calling us to a depth of presence and attention that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. And perhaps that is the greatest teaching of all, that what we seek is not found through investigation or explanation, but through the willingness to be present to mystery itself, to stand at the threshold of what we cannot know and to find, in that standing, a kind of peace that surpasses all understanding. The anchoress who froze in winter, walled up forever, has become eternal. And in her eternity, she teaches us still, across 7 centuries, that death and life, time and timelessness, self and the infinite are not the oppositions we believe them to be, but are instead the deepest unity underlying all existence. She has taught us this not through words or doctrines, but through the simple, profound act of choosing to be present, utterly, completely, without reservation, to the ground of being itself. And so the wall stands, and so the pilgrims come. And so the story continues to unfold, generation after generation, each person who encounters it finding within it something new, something that speaks directly to their own longing and their own search. The sealed cell holds its secret still, and in holding it, in remaining forever mysterious and inaccessible, it becomes a kind of mirror in which each of us can see reflected the deepest questions of our own existence, questions about who we are, what we truly seek, what it might mean to live with complete authenticity and presence. This is the story of Cecilia Hartwell, the anchoress who froze, who was walled up for winter and for forever. And this is the ongoing story of all those who have encountered her, who have felt her presence, who have allowed her life to illuminate their own understanding of what it means to be human, to seek, to transcend, and ultimately to become nothing so that one might become everything. May all who read this story find within it something that speaks to the deepest truth of their own being. May we all discover, in whatever form our particular life takes, the courage to be present to what is real. And may we always remember that the sacred is not distant from us, but lives in the very ground of our awareness, waiting only for our attention, our presence, our willingness to see. The anchor hold remains, sealed in stone, forever present, forever teaching, forever inviting us to step beyond the boundaries of what we think we are into the infinite mystery of what we might become.